No one in that prison had the slightest idea that the quietest man in the entire block was about to change everything. No one suspected that behind those calm eyes and silver hair was a past capable of flipping the entire hierarchy upside down. But fate has a strange habit of testing the silent ones. And that day, fate was about to reveal something nobody was prepared to see. The cafeteria was packed. Trays clattered. Muffled conversations blended with the metallic scrape of utensils on steel tables. The routine was always the same. Sit, eat, observe, survive. In there, men learned quickly who the predators were and who the prey was. The unwritten rule was simple. If you didn't show strength, someone would take it from you. At the center of that closed-off universe stood Roth Giant Malone, the most feared man in the block. Tall, muscles carved like living stone, tattoos etched with stories of violence, power, and respect earned through force. His presence alone kept voices low and eyes averted. Roth was the law in the shadows. Everyone knew it. But that day, his attention was on just one man, the new inmate. His name was Elias Hartman, 60 years old, average height, slow movements, well-kept gray hair, a calm gaze. Nothing about him suggested danger. In fact, his quiet posture bordered on fragility, the kind of man most believed wouldn't last a week inside. But anyone who truly paid attention would notice something else in him, in the way he breathed, in the way he held his silence, in how he occupied space without shrinking or puffing up. He looked centered, like someone who had watched storms his whole life without ever needing to shout to survive them. And calm like that, in a place fueled by impulse, drew attention. And attention was dangerous. Roth decided to test him. He walked up to Elias's table as the entire room watched. No warning. No taunts. Roth simply lifted a cup of water and, in front of everyone, poured it slowly over the older man's head. The water ran through the silver strands of hair, slid over his eyebrows, down his face and into the collar of his uniform. A public humiliation. A display of dominance. Silence fell. Not the silence of doubt. The silence of fear. But Elias just kept eating. He didn't look up. He didn't clench his jaw. He didn't show anger. He didn't shrink. He simply continued his meal, calm and unbothered as if nothing had happened. And that made the entire cafeteria stop breathing. Because in prison, humiliation demands a reaction. And usually that reaction is immediate. Violence, shouting, a fight. But Elias didn't respond. Not out of fear, but because he didn't need to prove anything. Roth's expression tightened. He was used to nervous laughter around him, to eyes looking at him for approval, to tension spreading the moment he moved. But now, there was something else in the air. Confusion. The inmates stared at Elias like they were witnessing something impossible. A frail-looking old man who didn't fear the most feared man in the prison. A prisoner who didn't bend under provocation. A silence that spoke louder than any threat. And in that split second, something unsettling flickered inside Roth. As if Elias knew something he didn't. As if the gray-haired man was standing above the whole power game. As if he saw everything from a height no one else could reach. The truth was simple. Elias carried decades of discipline inside him. Before his freedom was stripped away, he had spent his life teaching traditional martial arts. He was a master, not in the flashy, showy sense, but in the deeper meaning of the art. Control, patience, absolute focus. And sitting there with his tray, he wasn't withdrawing. He was watching. Every movement Roth made, every silence in the room, every shift in breathing, the entire environment had changed, though no one understood it yet. Because the man who looked fragile wasn't. The man who looked defenseless was the most prepared one there. The man who looked easy to break carried an ocean of strength no one could see. Roth stepped back, not out of fear, but out of something unfamiliar, something his instincts tried to name. There was something deeply wrong about the way that old man didn't react, something that was going to change everything. And so began a story of shattered pride, transformation, and real respect. And in that prison, no one would ever forget the name Elias Hartman. After the incident in the cafeteria, something shifted in the atmosphere of Black Ridge Penitentiary. There were no shouted threats, No fights breaking out, no territorial standoffs over tables. Nobody stared anyone down. The change was quiet, but it ran deep. It was as if everyone could feel an invisible thread pulled tight between two worlds, ready to snap at any moment. Roth, Giant Malone pretended it didn't bother him. He still walked the corridors with the same commanding posture. His footsteps echoed through the concrete halls, followed by the wary eyes of every inmate. But inside, something gnawed at him. Why didn't that old man react? For someone like Roth, a man who had built his entire life on the logic of dominance, that question was unsettling. Meanwhile, Elias carried on, as if nothing had happened. After finishing his meal, he simply stood up, placed his tray on the collection cart, and walked out of the cafeteria with the slow, easy calm of someone strolling through a quiet park at dusk. No hurry, no tension, just the steady presence of someone who knew exactly where he stood. His behavior caught the guards' attention. They had seen every kind of response before: panic, fury, pride, fear. But this calm didn't fit any pattern. Veteran guard Hoffman watched Elias from a distance every day. Hoffman had worked in the penitentiary long enough to read signs others ignored. And when he looked at the gray-haired man, he saw something rare: balance. Word spread among the inmates. Some claimed Elias had once been part of a secret organization. Others swore he was ex-military. Others said he was just an old man who had lost everything and no longer cared whether he lived or died. Every theory became more dramatic than the last. But the truth remained unseen. Not because it was complicated, but because nobody in that prison knew how to recognize power that didn't announce itself. Elias's cell reflected that same quiet discipline. The bed perfectly aligned, the blanket folded with precision, a small stack of old books on meditation in the corner, a neatly hung towel. Nothing extra, nothing missing, a life distilled to essentials. At night, while most inmates slept with their bodies tense and their minds racing, Elias sat upright and silent, spine straight, breathing deep and steady. He meditated, eyes closed, yet utterly aware. One curious thing: no one attempted to provoke him again. Not because they believed he could win a fight, but because they had no idea what he was capable of. And in that place, the unknown was more dangerous than any punch. Still, there were men who never let anything go unnoticed. Roth's followers. Their loyalty wasn't born from respect. It was born from fear of falling to the bottom of the hierarchy. To them, allowing someone to disregard the boss's authority was unacceptable. The balance of power had to be preserved. Among them, two stood out. Calder, the youngest, eager to prove himself. Doyle, the oldest, steady and calculating. They watched everything, every gesture, every silence, every shift in the room. "He's not normal," Calder muttered while folding his sheet. "He's not normal because he's got nothing left to lose," Doyle replied without looking up. "And people with nothing to lose are dangerous." But Doyle was wrong. Elias had plenty to lose. He had history, discipline, principles. He had something no one else in that prison possessed: peace. And peace, true, unshakable peace, was the greatest threat inside a place built on chaos. Across the facility, Roth sat in his cell, brow furrowed, staring at nothing. His pride had been challenged, but what he felt wasn't anger. It was curiosity. He understood the language of power and intimidation better than anyone. But Elias spoke an entirely different language, a silent one Roth had never needed to learn. And for that reason alone, he wanted to understand it. The next time they crossed paths wouldn't be in humiliation. Roth didn't want to break him. He wanted to know him. And without realizing it, Roth was already stepping into the beginning of his own transformation. The days that followed were marked by a tension so subtle it was almost impossible to describe. But everyone felt it. There were no confrontations, no arguments, no aggressive stares thrown across the yard. The cafeteria ran as usual. The hallways stayed quiet. The yard remained divided in the same groups, territories, and unspoken codes. Yet it was as if something beneath the surface had begun to shift. Something no one had words for. Elias continued his routine with disciplined consistency. He woke before the morning siren, made his bed with precise, deliberate care, washed his face, drew a slow breath, and sat to meditate. It was a daily ritual, as if despite the bars, walls, and cold concrete, he lived inside a space no one else could touch. His calm was what drew the most attention. It wasn't resignation, it was understanding. Roth, on the other hand, was unsettled. He didn't show it. His body remained powerful, his step steady, his gaze sharp. But something in his silence had changed. The men around him recognized it immediately. It was the silence before a storm, but the kind of storm no one knew which way would break. One overcast afternoon in the yard, Roth watched Elias from a distance. The gray-haired man sat beneath a patch of shade, eyes closed, hands resting lightly on his knees. There was nothing theatrical in the posture. It was natural, effortless, like watching someone who wasn't there to survive, but simply to be. Calder, young and eager to impress, noticed. "He's getting full of himself," he muttered, coming up beside Roth. "Ever since the cafeteria. We should send a message." Roth didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Elias, as if he were reading something hidden around him. "No," he said quietly. Calder blinked in surprise. "But if we don't do anything, the others will think." Roth turned his head, just slightly. It was enough. Calder fell silent. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about fear. It was curiosity. Roth wanted to understand that silence. He wanted to know where it came from, and whether he could break it. That evening in the cafeteria, Elias sat alone again. Not because he was avoiding anyone, but because he simply preferred the quiet of his own space. He liked hearing the room without being swallowed by it. Roth entered the cafeteria, and every pair of eyes followed him. He walked to Elias's table. This time, he carried nothing. No cup, no aggression, no challenge. He just sat down. It was like a quiet shockwave passed through the room. Conversation stopped. Utensils froze mid-air. The air thickened. Elias looked up, calm. "You didn't react," Roth said. "No build-up, no hesitation." Elias chewed, swallowed, and answered, "There was no reason to." Roth frowned, not in anger, but in genuine surprise. He had expected a justification, a moral defense, maybe even arrogance, but he got simplicity. "I tested you," Roth said. "I know," Elias replied. Silence. "You're not afraid of me?" Roth asked, the question everyone else had been carrying. Elias looked into his eyes, not with challenge, but with something startlingly human. "You're just a man. Men feel pain. They suffer. They learn. They make mistakes. And they change. There's nothing frightening about that." The words hit Roth with a force no punch could match. His entire identity had been built on being more than a man. Power, dominance, control. Yet Elias had reduced him to a truth he had spent his life avoiding. Everyone is human. Roth drew a long breath, and for the first time in years, hesitated. "Who are you?" he asked, not with superiority but with respect. Elias placed his spoon down, folded his hands, and spoke gently. "I was a kung fu instructor for 40 years. I taught teenagers, adults, police officers, workers. People who wanted strength, people who wanted peace. Now, I'm just looking for silence." The revelation rippled through the cafeteria like quiet electricity, and in that moment the story stopped being about power. It became about understanding. Roth didn't speak again. He simply stood up. No threat, no glare, no display of dominance. He just walked away, but his thoughts were burning. The conflict forming wasn't physical, it was internal. The next day, Roth would do something no one expected, something that would change the entire prison. The next morning, when the siren echoed through the halls of Blackridge, the routine looked the same as always. Doors slid open, footsteps lined up in rhythm, and low murmurs drifted through the cell block. But for some, the world had shifted. For the first time in a long while, Roth woke before the siren, not from restlessness, not from fear, from reflection. He sat at the edge of his bunk, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together, staring at the floor. Elias's words replayed in his mind as if they were stitched into his breath. "You are just a man." Simple, but they had found a place no one had ever reached. where the myth of who he was separated from the truth of who he had always been. Across the block, Calder watched Roth with growing frustration. For someone who lived by the logic of immediate dominance, Roth's silence felt like chaos. Calder needed things to make sense, and in his mind, sense meant control. Control meant action, and so he began forming plans of his own. In cell block C, where inmates rotated between work detail, rest time, and whispered conversations, Calder approached Doyle, the oldest, steadiest member of Roth's circle. "The boss is changing," Calder murmured, voice low, almost feline. Doyle didn't answer right away. He simply kept wiping down the metal table, every motion slow and deliberate. "He's not changing," Doyle finally said. "He's thinking, and that's worse than yelling." Calder's jaw tightened. He should have taken care of the old man in the cafeteria. Everyone saw, and they're talking. If he doesn't do something, everything falls apart. Doyle looked at him with the tired patience of a man who had seen hundreds of Calders rise and collapse under their own urgency. "So what do you think should be done?" Calder inhaled sharply. His mind was fast. Too fast. And absolutely convinced of what he called the natural order. "I can handle it. Make it clear to everyone how things work." Doyle didn't respond. His face didn't show agreement or rejection, only concern. He had seen too many men rush into battles they didn't understand. Power struggles only worked when the root was understood, and Calder was looking at the surface, not the depth. While Calder sharpened his intentions, Elias continued on with his serene rhythm. He meditated in the yard with a slow, steady breath, as if the world around him had no weight. He wasn't trying to teach. He wasn't trying to make a point. He simply existed. And simply existing was the greatest lesson he had ever given. That same afternoon, Hoffman, the most seasoned guard in Blackridge, walked over and sat near Elias. Not close enough to intrude, just close enough to share space. "Doesn't happen often," Hoffman said, staring at the gray sky. "Someone staying calm in a place like this." Elias opened his eyes slowly. "Calm isn't the absence of war," he said. "It's choosing not to fight the whole world at once." Hoffman didn't answer. The words hung inside him like something heavy and unforgettable. He had watched men break, rebuild, and destroy themselves inside these walls. But very few ever created peace. Elias was something he couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Roth walked the yard in silence. The scene looked ordinary. An older man under a patch of shade, a guard nearby, inmates scattered in groups. But something deeper was unfolding. Roth sensed a bridge forming, between a world built on fear and one built on understanding. A transformation was beginning. Quiet, internal, fragile, and it was about to shatter. Because Calder couldn't wait. He believed that attacking Elias would restore order, that it would reinforce Roth's power, that it would put everything back in place. But in reality, he was about to trigger the moment that would change everything. Not through force, not through violence, but through the revelation of something no one was ready to see. As the sun dipped behind the prison walls, Calder made his decision, and Elias, still seated in silence, seemed to sense it before anyone else did. The air shifted, the winds were changing, and fate was beginning to move. As the sun began to sink behind the high walls of Blackridge, the orange light filtering through the bars cast the yard in a warm, almost peaceful glow. Like for one brief moment, this forgotten place could pretend to be calm. But that calm was a lie, the kind that comes right before something inevitable. Elias sat in the same corner where he meditated every afternoon. Half covered in shadow, his breathing was slow, steady, rhythmic. Each inhale felt like a quiet conversation with time. Each exhale, a gentle release of the world's weight. Calder watched from a distance. He didn't see calm, he saw disregard. And in his young, restless mind, disregard was the same as disrespect. Calder walked toward Elias with firm, silent steps. He didn't want an audience, not yet. He wanted the impact first. He wanted Elias to feel who controlled the territory. He wanted everyone to remember that order still existed, that Roth was still the ruler, that nothing, absolutely nothing, could challenge that. But Calder wasn't defending Roth. He was defending what he believed Roth should be. And that difference was about to change everything. When he reached him, Calder stopped in front of Elias. The gray-haired man opened his eyes slowly, as if returning from somewhere deep, somewhere untouched by walls or violence. He didn't look surprised or tense, just present. "You think you're better than us?" Calder asked, voice low, urgent. Elias studied his face. Not with judgment, not with superiority, just awareness. "No," Elias replied. "I just stopped fighting you." Calder frowned. To him, that made no sense. "If you don't fight, you lose." Elias shook his head gently. "Not always. Sometimes fighting is the loss." A beat of silence. 1 second, 2, 3. Then Calder stepped forward. A small step. But to Roth, who had been watching from across the yard, it looked like a cliff opening beneath them. Roth stood immediately, something inside him clicking like an alarm. He began moving toward them, not running, but fast enough to show urgency. But Elias lifted his hand. Just a simple gesture. No contact. Just space. And time stopped. Calder froze. Not because he was held back physically, but because something in that gesture struck a part of him he didn't understand. It was as if Elias was saying, "You still have a choice." But Calder didn't know the language of silence. His decisions had always been reactions to the world outside, never responses from within. He moved forward, and that was the moment everything changed. There was no dramatic strike, no display of brute strength, no loud impact. Elias's movement was simple, soft, precise. A small sidestep, a guiding hand at the shoulder, a subtle shift in balance. And before anyone understood, Calder was on the ground, not slammed, not thrown, just lowered, as if his own body had quietly decided to rest. It was so fast and so subtle that no one knew what had happened. The yard went silent. Elias hadn't attacked. He hadn't retaliated. He hadn't even defended himself. He simply redirected the force that came toward him. Because control is not about overpowering someone else. It is about mastering yourself. Roth reached them just in time to see the end. He didn't see violence. He saw technique. He saw discipline. He saw years, decades of training transformed into something effortless and instinctive. And more importantly, he saw the truth. Elias wasn't a fragile old man. He didn't avoid conflict out of fear. He had simply moved beyond the need to prove anything. And that was the most dangerous power anyone could hold. Calder stood back up, not injured, but shaken to the core. He looked at Elias the way someone looks when the world has suddenly stopped making sense, when everything he believed needs to be rebuilt from scratch. Roth took a step forward. The two men, the leader who ruled by force and the master who ruled himself, stood face to face. No tension, just understanding. And in that moment, the prison witnessed something rare, not the clash of enemies, but the meeting of two different truths. And that meeting would change the fate of everyone inside Blackridge. Night fell over Blackridge like a heavy curtain. The corridors, lit by harsh white bulbs, somehow felt longer in the dark. Shadows stretched across the walls like memories no one dared speak aloud. And the scene from the yard had already begun to circulate. Not through shouts or stories, but through glances, through silence. There were no riots, no outbursts, no upheaval, but something had changed. Calder spent the rest of the day wordless. He walked to his cell, lay down on his bunk, and stared at the ceiling. It wasn't shame. It was something more complicated. It was as if his world had grown a new dimension he had no name for. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was thinking. And in that place, thinking was dangerous, because thinking leads to questions, and questions lead to change. Doyle noticed immediately. He had always been the kind of man who sensed shifts before anyone else did. When he saw Calder sitting in silence, he recognized it instantly. The foundation of their power structure had begun to move, and when foundations move, nothing stays the same. Roth walked the halls with a strange mix of unrest and clarity. The scene in the yard played over in his mind, not because Elias had defeated anyone, nor because Calder had been put on the ground. The weight of the moment was in what didn't happen. Elias could have struck back. He could have humiliated Calder publicly. He could have proved his strength, his dominance, his skill, But he chose something no one there understood. Control. Not control over others. Control over himself. Roth lay awake that night. He remembered his life before prison, when he was just a kid trying to survive. He remembered the moment he decided that strength solved everything, that if he could be feared, he would never have to bow to anyone. He built himself into a wall, a tall, thick, unbreakable wall, and that wall protected him. But now, for the first time, he wondered, a wall protects, but does it also trap the one who built it? Meanwhile, Elias sat cross-legged in his cell, eyes closed, breath steady. He wasn't proud of what occurred. He didn't feel victorious or superior. He simply let the moment pass. Decades of discipline had taught him that every event dissolves like ripples on a lake, so long as the water remains deep. The next morning, the air felt different. Inmates gathered in the yard for roll call. Guards watched from their posts, and everyone looked to Roth, waiting for retaliation, for a show of force, for the return of the story they all understood. That was how power survived in places like this. But instead of asserting control, Roth walked toward Elias. He stopped in front of him. The yard fell silent. Elias sat as he always did. Roth didn't fold his arms. He didn't lift his chin. He didn't loom. He simply said, "Teach me." The words struck the yard harder than any fight ever had. No one moved. No one breathed. Everything stopped. Elias opened his eyes and looked up at Roth, not surprised, but knowing, because a man only asks to learn when he's ready to change. "I can teach," Elias said, "but I can't teach someone who wants to be stronger than others, only someone who wants to be stronger than himself." Roth didn't speak. He just nodded. The turning point was complete. It hadn't happened through violence. It hadn't happened through defeat. It hadn't happened through force. It had happened through a request from a man exhausted by the weight of his own legend. And that morning, in front of walls, guards, and inmates, a leader began to stop being a wall and started to become a man. In the days that followed, the yard at Black Ridge began to hold something no one ever expected to see there: voluntary silence. Not the silence of fear, not the silence enforced by guards, but the silence of attention, the silence of curiosity, the silence that appears when something extraordinary is happening in plain sight. Every afternoon, as the sun leaned low over the hot concrete, Roth stood in front of Elias, not as a leader, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a student. That simple act rewrote the invisible hierarchy of the prison. Elias began each session the same way, through breath. "Feel your feet on the ground," he would say, voice calm and steady. "Here, now. Don't try to control the air. Just let it come. Let it go." At first, watching from a distance, Calder thought it was ridiculous. How could Roth, the most physical, most direct, most unshakable man in the prison, be standing still, breathing, following the guidance of someone he should have challenged? But as days passed, Calder noticed something subtle. Roth no longer looked heavy. His muscles were still there, solid as stone. But there was something gentler in how he carried himself. The constant tension in his shoulders had loosened. The hard gaze, the one that always formed a wall between him and the world, was changing. Not into weakness, into clarity. While Roth learned to breathe, Calder fought with something inside himself. Pride, fear, expectation. He wanted to step forward. He wanted to understand. But he had not yet found what Roth had found: the courage to admit something needed to change. Doyle saw all of this clearly. He watched the two of them, teacher and former powerhouse, the way you watch the first signs of a new season. He knew real change didn't arrive with noise or sudden force. It built itself layer by silent layer, until the world had no choice but to rearrange itself around it. Meanwhile, the conversations in the cafeteria began to shift. Before, the talk was about fights, territory, who ran things, who fell. Now, the whispers sounded different. "You see the way he moved yesterday? He doesn't look like the same Roth. It's not about fighting. It's control. Never thought anyone in this place could teach that. And never thought Roth would want to learn." The most powerful rumor wasn't that Roth was training. It was why he was training. He was tired. And everyone understood that kind of tired, even if they didn't say it out loud. As the days continued, the training evolved. Breath became posture. Posture became movement. Movement became precision. Elias never rushed. He never corrected with ego. He never asserted himself. He simply revealed to Roth how to find balance inside himself. Sometimes Roth lost it, breathing too fast, moving too hard, falling back into force. And every time Elias would say, "Begin again," and Roth would. No anger, no frustration, no collapse. That quiet willingness to begin again and again, was the deepest lesson of all. One afternoon, Hoffman watched the training from across the yard. He crossed his arms and allowed a small, rare smile to surface. "Never seen anything like this in here," Doyle said, stepping beside him. "Me neither," Hoffman replied. "But maybe this was what we were missing." Doyle looked up at the sky. If a man like Roth can change, maybe any of us can. But not everyone was ready. Because in places like Black Ridge, where strength decides survival, any shift in power means the balance will eventually need to be tested. Someone, at some point, would challenge it. But for now, there was peace. One afternoon, after a longer session, Roth drew in a deep, grounded breath and looked at Elias. "I thought spending my life being the strongest would make me untouchable," he said. "But all it ever did was give me a weight I didn't know how to put down." Elias met his gaze. Strength without direction becomes a cage, but strength with purpose becomes freedom. Roth nodded slowly. Like a truth he had chased his whole life had finally found him. "I want to continue," he said. "Then continue," Elias replied. "But not for me. For you." Roth didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, he knew exactly why he was there. And at that very moment, Calder, watching from a distance, finally understood. He didn't need to prove himself to Roth. He needed to discover who he was. The growth of one man had planted the seed of transformation in another, and that seed was about to grow. The new balance growing inside Black Ridge was like a small flame, delicate, fragile, but filled with potential. Roth continued training with Elias every day, and what had started as simple breathing had begun to take shape into coordinated, precise movement. The brute force that had once defined him was slowly gaining direction, form, and purpose. But even silent changes never stay unnoticed for long. That week, the prison's iron gates opened to receive a group of new transfers. Among them was a name that had stirred trouble in more than one facility: Vince Lauder, known as Viper. Vince wasn't big. He didn't have Roth's imposing physicality, nor Elias's quiet steadiness. His power came from somewhere else entirely: manipulation. He was the kind of man who could find the insecurity in others, plant a seed of doubt, and watch it grow like wildfire. He specialized in breaking unity, and Vince noticed the shift in Black Ridge before he even learned anyone's names. On his second day in the yard, he saw Roth training with Elias. He saw Calder watching in silence. He saw Doyle speaking calmly with Hoffman. He saw a yard at peace, and Vince smiled. To him, peace was an invitation. He walked over to the cluster of inmates who had always fed off Roth's shadow, the ones without their own power, who survived by orbiting someone else's. And that's where he began. "Strange thing going on here," he said, settling in beside them with the ease of a man who never needed permission. "The boss, training with the old man." The words were soft, almost casual. Seeds never needed to be thrown with force, they just needed the right soil. One inmate, Reeve, frowned. "It's not training, it's something else. He's changing." Vince smiled wider. "And you think that's a good thing?" The silence answered for them. Vince leaned forward as if sharing something sacred. When a leader changes, the ground under everyone shifts. Some start to doubt. Others start looking to take the throne. And someone always ends up paying the price. The men exchanged uneasy looks. Vince didn't have to say another word. The flame had been lit. Meanwhile, Calder was finally gathering the courage to approach Roth and Elias in the yard. His steps were slow, like each one was a conversation he was having with himself. He didn't want to admire them. He didn't want to imitate them. He wanted to understand. When he was close enough, Elias lifted his gaze, not surprised, not impatient. "Ready to sit?" he asked, as if inviting someone to enjoy the afternoon sun. Calder drew in a deep breath. I think so. Roth gave him a small nod. No ego, no authority, no challenge. Sit, he said simply. So Calder sat. That tiny, almost invisible moment shook the prison more than any fight ever had. Because in that moment, three forces reconciled: strength, pride, and the search for meaning. But while that was happening, Vince was still working. He didn't go to Elias. He didn't go to Roth. He went to the ones who feared losing something. He went to the ones afraid of change. Because fear is the oldest weapon in existence. By the third day, the yard was divided again. Not by hatred, by doubt. Eyes watched. Minds invented stories. Tensions rose without sound. And as always, the first crack came without warning. During afternoon count, a shove, small, quick, almost nothing, made two groups face each other like wolves in shrinking territory. No explosion, just the first split. Hoffman saw it. Doyle felt it. Roth noticed it. And Elias understood it. Before the yard dispersed, Roth approached Elias. It's starting, he said. Elias inhaled slowly, as though he had expected this from the beginning. Every real change is tested, he answered. The question is, will you respond as the man you used to be, or the man you're becoming? Roth didn't answer right away, because he knew that was the question that would decide everything. The climax was approaching, and this time, it wouldn't be a fight between two men. It would be a fight between who they were and who they needed to become. The tension inside Black Ridge had become almost physical. You could feel it in the air, heavy, dense, like the silence before a storm everyone knows is coming but no one knows when. The internal shift in Roth, the quiet growth in Calder, and the steady presence of Elias had formed a new structure within the prison, one that disturbed those who still lived in chaos. And Vince Lauder knew exactly how to turn discomfort into conflict. Late in the afternoon, during yard break, Vince gathered a small group of inmates behind the steel partitions separating the wings. He spoke softly, but his words spread like a slow poison. You see it, don't you? He murmured, gesturing casually. The leadership changed, and none of you were asked. None of you were included. You're just watching, like background characters, while he decides what this place is going to become. The faces around him tightened. It wasn't hatred. It was fear. And fear, when nurtured, becomes action. What if tomorrow he doesn't want you near him anymore? Vince continued, voice smooth, controlled. What if he's already chosen who gets to stand next to him? Are you just going to accept that? Murmurs. Unease. The quiet burn of identity being questioned. No one realized that Vince wasn't accusing Roth. He was accusing the fear of losing place. The fear of losing value. The fear of becoming no one. When the yard opened, the silence was too still. The sky was gray, ready to break into rain. The air was colder than it should have been. Roth and Elias were in their usual training space. Calder seated nearby, watching closely. Doyle leaned against a wall, arms crossed, steady and aware. Hoffman walked the perimeter, feeling something that wasn't quite a thought, just instinct. Then Vince's group approached. They didn't run, they didn't shout. They simply walked, step by step, until they stood in front of Roth. The entire yard froze. Roth turned slowly, not defensive, just present. Vince stepped forward, not aggressive, not confrontational. He knew the power wasn't in striking first. It was in defining what the moment meant. You've changed, Vince said, voice calm. And we didn't change with you. Roth breathed in. That breath, slow, grounded, deliberate, was his first answer. I changed because I was tired of carrying something I didn't need anymore, he said. And you expect us to just follow that? Vince countered. No questions, no say, no leadership. Roth looked around him. He saw the men who had followed him out of fear, not respect. Men who had never learned to breathe before reacting. He saw versions of his old self, multiplied, repeated, trapped. I never asked to be a leader, Roth said. I just survived longer than you. The yard went silent. It was the truth no one had ever spoken aloud. Vince's smile flickered. Not amusement, but calculation shifting. So if you're not trying to lead, he said softly, tilting his head, Then who is? The moment called for only two things: courage and a true identity. Roth looked at Elias, not to offer him as an answer, but to remember who he was becoming. Elias didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply held Roth's gaze, steady, deep, unwavering. Roth turned back to the men standing before him. "I'm not stepping down from leading," he said, voice firm but free of force. "I'm stepping down from dominating." He stepped forward. "If you want to keep living in fear, in chaos, fighting over territory no one actually owns, go ahead. But I'm not going to become who I was just to make you comfortable." The men in front of him shifted, not backward, but inward. Something inside them had moved. Courage changes the weight of the air. And in that moment, Vince realized, maybe for the first time since arriving, that he had made a mistake. He wasn't standing in front of the old Roth. He was standing in front of a Roth who finally knew who he was. Elias stepped beside Roth, not as a leader, but as witness. Calder stood up too. Doyle crossed his arms and nodded. And in the distance, Hoffman watched with something close to pride. Vince tried to respond, but nothing came, because a man who has nothing left to prove cannot be broken. The yard breathed together, and the storm, the one everyone expected, never came, because the real climax wasn't a fight. It was clarity. Strength is not in breaking someone else. Strength is in finally letting your own past fall away. After that day, the rhythm inside Black Ridge changed in a way no one could have predicted. There was no announcement, no speech, no truce between cell blocks. The shift happened in the hardest and the most authentic way possible, from the inside out. Roth didn't stop being respected. In truth, the respect evolved. Before, men feared him for what he could destroy. Now they respected him for what he could build. The yard was no longer a battleground. Stairs no longer carried threat. And for the first time in a very long time, the space felt like it breathed with the men who lived there. Calder began training alongside Roth. At first unsure, caught between everything he had been taught and everything he was starting to understand. But slowly he found something he had never known before: stillness. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of internal war. For the first time, he wasn't fighting to prove anything. He was learning how to exist within himself. Doyle stepped closer too, not as a student, but as someone who recognized wisdom when he saw it. He had always known his own time would come, and it had begun long before Black Ridge ever entered his story. Even Hoffman, the guard who had spent decades seeing nothing but chaos, felt something new growing there. He still did his job, but no longer with the hardened stare of a man who had given up on people. Now, there was understanding. He knew that some walls don't need to be torn down. They just need one person willing to stand differently. And Elias? He remained the same, sitting in the yard at dawn, breathing, watching, living inside the silence he had built within himself. He never sought followers, never tried to change anyone, never aimed to take control, because real change never comes from force. It comes from example. His presence didn't just change Roth. It changed how the men saw themselves. Because when a man realizes he doesn't have to be ruled by anger, he starts to see paths that had always been there. Black Ridge was still a prison. The walls were still high. The gates still locked. The rules still harsh. But inside certain men there was something new. Something that could not be confiscated, inspected, or chained. Choice. And that quiet, personal, profound choice was what Elias had been teaching all along. Without speeches, without force, without demands, just by living. Months later, Roth breathed with ease. Calder walked with a different posture. Doyle smiled sometimes. Hoffman watched without the same weight in his eyes. And Elias remained under the same patch of shade, unchanged, and yet the source of every change. When people asked Roth what had shifted, he always said, "I stopped trying to fight the whole world, and I started learning how to stop fighting myself." And no one ever forgot it. If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment. Write, "True strength begins in silence." Like the video so it can reach more people. Share it with someone who needs peace, clarity, or a new way of seeing the world. And if you enjoy deep, emotional, meaningful stories, subscribe and turn on notifications. Our journey doesn't end here. It starts now, inside you.